My name is Celeste Hartwell, and by the time I was 35, I was a vice president at a major pharmaceutical company. Sounds impressive to some, perhaps. To my family, however, it mostly sounded like I was very good at drug sales. Have you ever poured your heart and soul, years of your life, into achieving something complex and meaningful? Only to have the people who are supposed to know you best, the people whose validation you secretly crave, reduce it all to a flippant, dismissive label? Imagine that feeling, then multiply it by a lifetime and you'll have a sense of where this story begins. It reached a head in a sterile hospital room, a place of fear and desperation, where the two worlds I inhabited, the one my family saw, and the one I truly lived, were about to collide in a way none of us could have ever predicted. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I always find that so interesting. And if you've ever felt profoundly underestimated, or had to fight twice as hard just to be seen for who you truly are, especially by your own family, go ahead and hit that like button. Maybe subscribe too, because this space is for stories like ours, stories of finding your own way and your own worth. My childhood wasn't unhappy, not in the overt sense. We lived in a comfortable suburban house. My father, Arthur, was an engineer, a man of slide rules and blueprints in his early days, then CAD programs and complex schematics. He was logical, steady, but emotionally reserved. My mother, Clara, was a whirlwind of community projects and social engagements, her focus always diffuse, spread thin across a dozen charities and committees. I have an older brother, David, who was the golden child. David was effortlessly charming, athletic, and followed a conventional path into finance that my parents understood and lauded. He bought the right car, married the right girl, produced grandchildren at respectable intervals. His life was a neat checklist, impeccably completed. And then there was me. I was the quiet one, the observer, the one with her nose perpetually in a book. My fascination wasn't with dolls or sports, but with the intricate workings of the natural world. I had a cheap microscope and spent hours examining pond water. I meticulously charted the growth of plants in our garden. When our cat, Mittens, got sick, I was the one who read the veterinarian's pamphlets cover to cover, asking questions that made the poor man blink. My parents indulged these quirks with a kind of benign neglect. "Oh, that's just Celeste and her little projects," Mom would say with an airy wave of her hand before turning back to a phone call about the church bake sale. Dad would occasionally peer over my shoulder at whatever I was dissecting, usually an unfortunate insect, grunt an, interesting, and retreat to his workshop. The seeds of conflict, or rather, the seeds of their profound misunderstanding of me, were sown early. When I excelled in science fairs, winning regional competitions with projects on enzyme activity or bacterial resistance, their pride was muted, confused. "Well, isn't that clever?" Mom would offer, as if I'd produced an unusually intricate macrame owl. David's football trophies, his debate team wins, those were displayed prominently. My certificates and ribbons often ended up in a box in my closet. It wasn't malicious, I don't think. It was simply that my passions lay outside their sphere of comprehension, or perhaps their sphere of interest. Science, especially the deep, intricate biology that fascinated me, was abstract, messy, not nearly as straightforward or socially acceptable as David's clear trajectory. I remember one parent-teacher conference in high school. My biology teacher, Mr. Henderson, a man whose enthusiasm for the Krebs cycle was infectious, told my parents, "Celeste has a remarkable aptitude for the biological sciences. She has the mind of a researcher. You should really encourage her to pursue medicine or scientific research." I sat there, heart swelling with a rare burst of hope. Mom smiled politely and said, "Oh, we're just happy she's doing well in her subjects. She's always been such a good, quiet girl." Later, in the car, she'd mused, "A researcher, imagine. Such a lonely life, cooped up in a laboratory. Perhaps something in nursing, dear? That's a wonderful, caring profession for a woman." The implication was clear. My ambition was unbecoming, or at least inconveniently different. David, meanwhile, was praised for his killer instinct on the trading floor simulations his economics club ran. That was ambition they understood. Mine was an oddity. When I declared my intention to major in molecular biology and then pursue a doctorate, the reaction was a mixture of bewilderment and faint disapproval. "So much schooling, Celeste," Dad said, frowning. "Are you sure you wouldn't prefer something quicker, more practical?" David by then was already an intern at a prestigious bank, his future gleaming. The subtext was always there. David was the success story, the one fulfilling their expectations. I was the enigma, the one veering off the well-trodden path into a wilderness they couldn't map. My achievements were met with a polite, distant acknowledgement, like news from a foreign country whose customs they didn't quite grasp. Oh, another degree? How diligent. It was the academic equivalent of patting me on the head. The real catalyst, the event that would eventually bring all this simmering, unspoken family dysfunction to a boil, was my father's illness. It started subtly. Dad, always so robust, began to tire easily. He lost weight. He developed a persistent, dry cough. His local doctor ran tests, then more tests. Specialists were consulted. The initial diagnoses were vague, unsatisfactory. Then, one Tuesday morning, my mother called me, her voice tight with a panicky edge I'd rarely heard. "Celeste, it's your father. He collapsed. They've taken him to City General. It's serious." I was on the next flight out, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. By the time I reached the hospital, the family was gathered in a small, grim waiting room. My mother was pale, her usual composure fractured. David was there, looking stressed, pacing and talking in hushed, urgent tones on his phone, probably to his office, I guessed. His wife, Jennifer, sat beside my mother, offering a comforting hand. When I walked in, their conversation paused. "Oh, Celeste," Mom said, her voice thin. "You made it." There was no embrace, just a weary acknowledgement. David ended his call. "Hey Celeste, nasty business this, they don't seem to know what's wrong with him." He gave me a brief distracted nod, then turned to Jennifer. "Did Dr. Ramirez say anything new?" The air was thick with anxiety, but also with that familiar dynamic. David was in charge of information, of action. I was just there. Another worried relative. In those initial hours, as doctors came and went, speaking in hushed tones, the family's focus was entirely on the medical pronouncements. My presence was peripheral. At one point, as I listened intently to a young resident explaining a battery of tests they were running, my Aunt Carol, Dad's sister, arrived. She bustled in, all anxious energy, and after a cursory hello to me, turned to my mother. "Clara, this is terrible. Are the doctors any good here? Should we get a second opinion from someone at the Mayo Clinic? David, you should look into that." My input wasn't sought. My professional life, the one where I dealt with complex medical research and pharmaceutical development daily, was a non-entity in that room. It was as if I'd walked in from a completely unrelated job, like selling artisanal soaps for all the relevance they assigned to my presence. The emotional impact on me was a complex brew. Overwhelming worry for my father, of course. He was a man of few words, but he was my dad, and the thought of losing him was a cold fist clenching my heart. But layered on top of that was a familiar, bitter frustration. Here I was, a vice president at PharmaLife Innovations, a company at the forefront of developing treatments for rare and complex diseases, and my own family was treating me like a well-meaning but ultimately clueless bystander. I listened to their increasingly panicked and often ill-informed speculations about Dad's condition, biting my tongue. I heard them discuss medical terminology they barely understood, throwing around names of diseases they'd Googled, their fear making them grasp at straws. I wanted to scream, "I understand this language. I live and breathe this stuff." But the wall of their ingrained perception of me felt impenetrable. I felt that old sting of being underestimated, of being invisible in the very area where I had dedicated my life. There were moments of acute despair, sitting in the corner of that waiting room, feeling utterly helpless, not because of the medical mystery, but because of the relational one. How could they not see? How could they not even think to ask? Their dismissal wasn't overt hostility, it was something far more insidious, a complete blind spot. When Dr. Evans, the lead consultant, came to speak with the family, they all leaned in, hanging on his every word. He was a distinguished, gray-haired physician, clearly competent, but he looked tired and perplexed. He explained that Dad's symptoms were atypical, a constellation of issues affecting his respiratory, renal, and neurological systems simultaneously. "We're running a broad panel for rare autoimmune disorders, and some atypical infections," he said, his brow furrowed. "His decline is concerningly rapid." My mother clutched David's arm. "But what could it be, doctor? Is there anything at all you can do? David, ever the man of action, asked, "What are the next steps? What specialists are you bringing in? We want the best for him." Dr. Evans nodded. "We're consulting with immunology and nephrology. We're doing everything we can." During a brief pause, I ventured a question. "Doctor, have you considered looking at elevated levels of specific cytokines, perhaps interleukin-6 or TNF-alpha, in relation to the neurological degradation?" Sometimes, in rapid onset conditions like this, a cytokine storm can mimic primary neurological disorders but have an autoimmune or paraneoplastic origin. A hush fell. Dr. Evans turned to me, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Before he could answer, my Aunt Carol chimed in, her tone patronizingly kind. "Oh, Celeste dear, that's very technical. Let's leave the complicated medical talk to the doctors, shall we? You must be tired from your flight." My mother gave a weak, agreeing nod. "Yes, dear, this is all very overwhelming." David shot me a look that was a mixture of annoyance and embarrassment, as if I'd committed a social faux pas. "Celeste, Dr. Evans has this under control." My cheeks burned. It wasn't just that they dismissed my question, it was the casual, almost reflexive way they reinforced my perceived incompetence. They rationalized their actions by framing my contribution as an unnecessary intrusion, an amateur attempting to play in the professional's sandbox. Their justification was unspoken but clear. I sold drugs for a living. What could I possibly know about the intricate diagnostics of a life-threatening illness? Their fear and their ingrained biases made them cling to the established hierarchy. The doctors were the experts, David was the family spokesperson, and I was, Celeste, the quiet one, the one with the drug sales job. The irony was a bitter pill I had to swallow in silence. In their eyes, my career, my entire adult life's work, was so trivialized that it rendered me mute in a situation where my knowledge could have been vital. Despite the sting of their dismissal, a cold resolve began to form within me. I wouldn't storm out. I wouldn't make a scene. My father's life was at stake. My vow was a quiet, internal one. I would stay, I would observe, I would listen. And if, by some chance, an opening presented itself, if my specific knowledge could genuinely make a difference, I would find a way to make it known. Family dynamics be damned. My perseverance, in this immediate crisis, wasn't about proving them wrong for my own ego, it was about the desperate hope that I might hold a piece of the puzzle that could save him. This resolve was fueled by years of having to push forward on my own, of achieving despite, rather than because of, family encouragement. My journey to becoming a vice president at PharmaLife Innovations had been anything but easy. It was a path paved with grueling hours, immense pressure, and countless sacrifices. While David was climbing the corporate ladder in finance, attending power lunches and closing deals, I was immersed in the often unseen, unglamorous world of scientific research and development. My doctoral research on cellular signaling pathways had been an obsession, involving years of late nights in the lab, staring into microscopes until my eyes burned. Meticulously documenting experiments that failed far more often than they succeeded. There were moments of profound doubt, times when I felt like an imposter, wondering if I truly had what it took. The academic world is relentlessly competitive, and the path to a PhD is a marathon of intellectual endurance and emotional resilience. After my doctorate, I didn't choose the quieter life of academic research. I was drawn to the pharmaceutical industry, to the place where scientific discovery could be translated into tangible treatments that impacted lives. The work was demanding, the stakes incredibly high. I started as a research scientist, part of a team working on novel therapeutic compounds. The hours were punishing. I remember stretches where I practically lived at the lab, fueled by lukewarm coffee and the adrenaline of chasing a breakthrough. There were projects that consumed years of my life, only to be shelved due to unforeseen side effects or lack of efficacy in clinical trials. Each setback was a blow, but each small success, each step forward, was a powerful motivator. I recall one particular project early in my career, developing a therapy for a rare pediatric neurological disorder. The patient population was tiny, the science incredibly complex. We worked against the clock, knowing that for these children and their families, time was a luxury they didn't have. There were nights I slept on a cot in my office, poring over data, trying to find a pattern, a solution. My social life withered. Family gatherings were often missed, or I'd arrive late, exhausted, my mind still back in the lab. My explanations for my absence or distraction were met with that familiar, polite bewilderment. "Still busy with your chemicals, dear?" Mom would ask, her tone suggesting it was a slightly eccentric hobby I hadn't yet outgrown. They saw the cost, the missed holidays, the tired eyes, but they never truly grasped the passion, the profound sense of purpose that drove me. Promotions came not easily but steadily, earned through sheer hard work, innovative thinking, and a refusal to give up. I moved from lead scientist to project manager, then to director of a research division, and finally to vice president of orphan drug development. Each step involved more responsibility, more pressure, navigating not just the science, but also the complex regulatory landscapes, the high-stakes financial decisions, and the leadership of large, multidisciplinary teams. I had presented to boards of directors, to FDA panels, to international scientific congresses. I had overseen budgets in the hundreds of millions of dollars. My world was one of cutting-edge science, of global health challenges, of bringing hope to patients with devastating diseases. It was a universe away from their simplistic drug sales label. The sacrifices were immense, personal relationships strained, hobbies abandoned, sleep often a forgotten luxury. But the reward was the knowledge that my work mattered, that it had the potential to alleviate suffering and save lives. This was the reality they consistently failed to see. Throughout my career, I had been fortunate to find allies, people who saw my potential and nurtured it. My PhD advisor, Dr. Anya Sharma, had been a formidable mentor, pushing me, challenging me, but always believing in my abilities. At PharmaLife, there was Dr. Peterson, the senior VP of Research and Development, who took a chance on me, promoting me to lead a critical project when I was still relatively young. He saw past my quiet demeanor to the fierce determination and sharp intellect beneath. My team, the brilliant scientists, clinicians, and regulatory experts I worked with every day, they were my professional family. They understood the pressures, celebrated the victories, and commiserated over the setbacks. Their respect, their collaboration, was a constant affirmation of my worth in a way my own family's validation never was. These were the people who knew the real Celeste Hartwell, the scientist, the leader, the innovator. Their belief in me was a quiet counterpoint to the polite incomprehension I faced at home. In the sterile confines of that hospital, their faces, their words of encouragement flickered in my mind, a reminder that my contributions were real, even if unrecognized by those closest to me by blood. The contrast between my lived professional reality and my family's perception was stark, and never more so than in that hospital. As Dad's condition worsened, the atmosphere grew heavier. The doctors were clearly struggling. Tests came back inconclusive or negative for the more common culprits. My mother was becoming increasingly distraught, oscillating between tearful prayers and frantic phone calls to distant relatives for advice. David, frustrated by the lack of clear answers, began to research alternative clinics, his brow perpetually furrowed with a mixture of anxiety and an almost aggressive desire to do something. He'd pace the hallway, muttering about incompetence and getting Dad to a better facility, as if a change of scenery alone would solve the complex medical puzzle. I remember him at one point, having just gotten off the phone with a concierge medical service, announcing, "I've got a contact at a specialist clinic in Houston. They deal with undiagnosed conditions. It'll cost a fortune, but Dad's worth it." He looked around for affirmation. Mom nodded tearfully. Aunt Carol said, "Oh, David, you always know what to do." Meanwhile, I was quietly observing Dad's charts when I could get a discreet look, listening intently to every medical update, cross-referencing the symptoms with the vast database of rare diseases in my mind. The specific combination of rapid respiratory failure, acute kidney injury, and the subtle but distinct neurological signs, a slight tremor in his hands, a momentary confusion he tried to mask, was beginning to coalesce into a terrifyingly familiar pattern, something I'd encountered in the deepest, most specialized corners of my work. It was like watching a ghost from a research paper materialize before my eyes. My quiet intensity, however, was misinterpreted by my family as passive worry, perhaps even a lack of engagement. While David was loud and active in his search for solutions, I was quiet and introspective, my mind racing through differential diagnoses and treatment protocols. Their anxiety manifested as noise, mine as a deepening, focused silence. This only reinforced their existing narrative. David was the capable one, the problem solver. I was just present. The unfairness of it was a dull ache, but the urgency of Dad's situation overshadowed any personal indignation. The days blurred into a monotonous cycle of fear and frustration. Dr. Evans and his team were clearly giving it their all, but they were hitting B. Dad was moved to the intensive care unit. His breathing became more labored, his consciousness fluctuating. The family's mood swung between desperate hope and bleak despair. David was on the phone constantly, trying to pull strings, arrange transfers, consult with his high-powered contacts who knew the best doctors. Each of his pronouncements about potential new avenues was met with eager attention from Mom and Aunt Carol. "David's talking to a top neurologist in Boston," Mom would whisper, a flicker of hope in her eyes. It was as if they believed that sheer force of will or the right connections in unrelated fields could somehow conjure a diagnosis. During one particularly bleak afternoon, Dr. Evans met with us in a small consultation room. His face was etched with exhaustion and concern. "Mr. Hartwell's condition is critical," he began, his voice grave. "We've run extensive tests. We've ruled out numerous conditions. Frankly, the specific constellation of symptoms and the speed of their progression is something I haven't encountered often in my career. We are treating his symptoms aggressively, supporting his organ systems, but we are struggling to identify the underlying pathology." Mom let out a small sob. David leaned forward, his jaw tight. "So, what you're saying is, you don't know what's wrong with him?" "We have some theories," Dr. Evans said carefully, "but nothing definitive. We're discussing experimental treatments, but without a clear diagnosis, it's like shooting in the dark." He looked at us, his eyes filled with a weary empathy. "I need to be frank. We are running out of options and time." It was, in that moment, the air thick with unspoken fear, the unspoken possibility of loss, that I saw a subtle shift. A younger doctor, a fellow named Dr. Chen, who I'd noticed was particularly meticulous and observant, had been present at several of the updates. He'd occasionally glanced at me when I'd asked my earlier dismissed technical question, not with annoyance but with a flicker of something I couldn't quite decipher. Curiosity, perhaps? Now, as Dr. Evans spoke, Dr. Chen was looking at the notes again, then briefly at me. It wasn't overt, but it was a crack in the wall of their collective obliviousness. He didn't say anything, but his gaze seemed to acknowledge my presence in a way that the senior consultant, overwhelmed by the crisis and the family's dynamics, had not. It was the faintest glimmer of potential allyship, a silent acknowledgement that perhaps not everyone in the room saw me as just Celeste, the drug saleswoman. The foreshadowing of the climax was not a dramatic announcement, but a deepening sense of dread, a closing in of possibilities. The doctors spoke of supportive care, a term I knew often meant they were managing the decline rather than fighting for a recovery. My mother began talking about Dad's wishes, about funeral arrangements, her voice choked with grief. David, for once, was quiet, his usual bluster deflated by the grim reality. The family started to discuss the logistics of the inevitable, their conversations hushed and sorrowful. The hospital, with its beeping machines and hushed corridors, felt like a pressure cooker, the tension building relentlessly. I knew with a chilling certainty that if I had any insight, any knowledge that could alter this trajectory, the window to share it was closing with terrifying speed. The weight of what I suspected, what my years of specialized work were screaming at me, became almost unbearable. The upcoming moment wasn't going to be about a family gathering or a business presentation, it was going to be about life or death, played out in the stark, unforgiving theater of the ICU. The pivotal event, the setting for the climax, arrived with a grim finality. Dr. Evans called us into the family consultation room adjoining the ICU. The air was heavy, sterile. My father was behind a glass wall, a pale figure amidst a web of tubes and monitors, his chest rising and falling with the rhythmic sigh of the ventilator. Dr. Evans looked even more somber than before. My mother was gripping David's hand so tightly her knuckles were white. Aunt Carol was openly weeping into a handkerchief. "I'm afraid I don't have good news," Dr. Evans began, his voice low and devoid of hope. "Mr. Hartwell's organ functions are deteriorating rapidly. The supportive measures are failing to keep pace." We've consulted with every specialist available, run every conceivable test. We are facing a cascade organ failure, and we still don't have a definitive underlying cause that we can effectively target. At this point, he paused, his gaze filled with compassion. At this point, we need to discuss comfort care, about making him as comfortable as possible in the time he has left. The words hung in the air, devastating, absolute. My mother let out a strangled cry. David's face was ashen. Even Aunt Carol's sobs subsided into a stunned silence. It was in this abyss of despair, with all conventional hope extinguished, that the truth I held became not just a piece of knowledge, but a lifeline, however improbable. The public in this semi-public exposure was small, my family and the medical team, but the stakes couldn't have been higher. The injustice of their lifelong dismissal of me, of my work, was about to be dwarfed by the potential for an almost unimaginable vindication, one I would have traded in a heartbeat for my father's health. I took a deep breath. My voice, when I spoke, was surprisingly calm, cutting through the thick silence. "Dr. Evans," I said, my tone steady and professional, all traces of the overlooked daughter momentarily erased. The constellation of symptoms, the rapid decline in renal and pulmonary function, the specific neurocognitive deficits I've observed, the resistance to broad-spectrum immunosuppressants. Has anyone considered corticospinal degeneration syndrome, type 4? Specifically, the hyper-inflammatory variant? Every head in the room swiveled towards me. Dr. Evans stared, his expression unreadable for a moment. My mother looked at me with bewildered, tear-filled eyes. David's mouth opened slightly, as if to tell me to be quiet, then snapped shut. Aunt Carol just looked confused. Dr. Evans frowned. CDS type 4? That's exceedingly rare, almost unheard of. The diagnostic criteria are complex, and it typically presents in a slightly different demographic. The hyperinflammatory variant presents atypically, I stated, not argumentatively, but factually. It often mimics severe sepsis or a runaway autoimmune response, leading to rapid multi-organ failure. The standard markers can be misleading. You need to look for specific anti-neuronal antibodies, particularly against myelin oligodendrocyte glycoprotein and a unique cytokine signature, heavily weighted towards GM-CSF and interleukin-17, not just the usual IL-6 or TNF-alpha suspects. Dr. Chen, the younger fellow who had been standing slightly behind Dr. Evans, leaned forward, his eyes alight with sudden intense interest. The GM-CSF elevation, we saw an anomaly there, but it was attributed to a possible secondary infection. It's often misinterpreted, I continued, my focus entirely on the physicians. My company, PharmaLife Innovations, received FDA approval for a targeted monoclonal antibody therapy, CSX7, brand name Revivane, for precisely this condition 18 months ago. It neutralizes the pathological GM-CSF cascade. I was the vice president overseeing the Phase 3 clinical trials and the subsequent orphan drug fast-track designation. I know the diagnostic protocol intimately. I wrote part of it. The silence that followed was profound. It was the silence of utter shock, of disbelief warring with a desperate, dawning hope. Dr. Evans was staring at me, his professional mask momentarily gone, replaced by an expression of stunned reevaluation. David looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. His face was a mask of confusion, his eyes wide. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, her gaze fixed on me, no longer just her quiet, perplexing daughter, but a stranger speaking a language of impossible authority. Aunt Carol simply looked dumbfounded, her mouth agape. The power dynamic in that small, sterile room had just been seismically, irrevocably altered. The drug saleswoman had just offered a diagnosis and a cutting-edge treatment for a condition that had baffled a team of experienced specialists. The consequences of their lifelong underestimation were crashing down upon them, silent and undeniable, in the face of my father's fading life. In the immediate aftermath of my revelation, the atmosphere in that consultation room crackled with a new, urgent energy. Dr. Evans, after a moment of stunned silence, leaned forward, his fatigue seemingly vanishing, replaced by keen focus. CSX7, Revivane, he repeated, testing the names. PharmaLife Innovations. You were on the development team? I led the final stages of development and regulatory approval, yes, I confirmed, keeping my voice level, though my heart was pounding. We saw cases exactly like my father's in the compassionate use program before approval. The presentation is almost identical. Dr. Chen spoke up, his voice quick with excitement. We can run the specific antibody panel you mentioned. The lab can prioritize it. And the cytokine signature, we have the raw data, we can reanalyze it for that specific profile. Dr. Evans nodded, his eyes fixed on me. Celeste, Miss Hartwell, if this is CDS type 4, this drug, Revivane, is it available? How quickly could we get it? Our company has an emergency access protocol for critical cases, I said. I can make the call. If the diagnostic markers align and you concur with the assessment, we could potentially have it here within hours. It requires a specialized infusion protocol. I paused. I have that protocol memorized. My vindication wasn't a triumphant gloat. There was no room for that. It was in the sudden, absolute shift in how I was perceived. I was no longer the peripheral family member. I was the expert in the room, the one holding a potential key. Dr. Evans and Dr. Chen began to pepper me with highly technical questions about the drug's mechanism of action, potential side effects, contraindications, the specific diagnostic criteria nuances. I answered them precisely, drawing on years of ingrained knowledge. My family sat in stunned silence, watching this exchange as if witnessing an alien abduction. Their previous dismissiveness, their casual belittling of my career, now hung in the air, a shameful, unspoken testament to their profound ignorance of who I truly was. The antagonists, my family, faced an immediate and devastating loss of standing. David, who had been so vocal, so in charge, was utterly silent. He stared at me, then at the doctors, then back at me, his expression a mixture of shock, confusion, and something that looked like dawning horror as the implications of his lifelong misjudgment began to sink in. My mother just kept looking at me, tears streaming down her face now, but for a different reason. They were tears of shock, perhaps, and a nascent, terrifying hope. Aunt Carol, for once, had nothing to say. Their authority, their very sense of place in this crisis, had evaporated. They were now the bystanders, and I, the dismissed daughter, was at the center of the frantic, hopeful activity. Their world had been turned upside down. The drug sales they had so casually disparaged was now the most important phrase in their vocabulary. The medical team became my immediate, focused allies. Dr. Evans, a man of immense professional integrity, wasted no time. Dr. Chen, get the lab on stat for those specific antibodies and rerun the cytokine panel immediately. Miss Hartwell, he said, turning back to me, his voice now imbued with a deep respect, could you liaise with our pharmacy about this Revivane? Assuming the tests confirm your hypothesis, we need to be ready. He treated me as a high-level colleague, a peer. The shared urgency, the collaborative effort to save my father, forged an instant, powerful bond. Nurses who had previously offered me sympathetic but distant smiles now looked at me with a new curiosity and respect. I was no longer just a worried daughter, I was a vital part of the potential solution. The tentative changes in family relationships began almost immediately, though awkwardly. As I was on the phone with PharmaLife's emergency medical director, coordinating the potential shipment of Revivane, I felt a touch on my arm. It was my mother. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed. Celeste, she whispered, her voice choked. I had no idea. All these years, what you actually do. It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was a crack in the dam of her lifelong incomprehension. David stood rigidly by the window, his back to me, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. He didn't speak, couldn't seem to meet my eye. The familiar family dynamic had been shattered, and in its place was a vast, uncertain space. The old roles were gone. For the first time in my life, in a moment of extreme crisis, my family was looking at me, truly looking, and seeing someone they didn't recognize, someone whose capabilities they had never bothered to understand. The power had shifted, not because I had seized it, but because reality had thrust it upon me. My father's life hung in the balance, and his unlikely savior was the daughter they thought sold pills for a living. The next few hours were a blur of intense activity. The lab rushed the tests. Dr. Chen, his face alight with intellectual fervor, confirmed the presence of the specific anti-MOG antibodies and the distinct cytokine signature I had described. It was, indeed, the hyperinflammatory variant of corticospinal degeneration syndrome type 4. Dr. Evans, after reviewing the results, looked at me with a mixture of awe and profound gratitude. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, "you may have just saved your father's life." Revivane arrived by special courier, chilled and precious. I worked with the ICU nurses and Dr. Chen to go over the infusion protocol, explaining the titration schedule, potential reactions to monitor, and the specific supportive care measures required. My family watched from the periphery, silent, their faces a canvas of complex emotions, shock, guilt, and a dawning fragile hope. The first infusion began. We all watched the monitors, every beep, every flicker of data, holding our collective breath. There was no immediate miracle. The first 12 hours were critical, a delicate balancing act, but then, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, things began to shift. Dad's oxygen saturation levels stabilized, then began to climb. His kidney function showed subtle signs of improvement, the tremors lessened. By the next morning he was more alert than he had been in days, his eyes, though still weak, focusing on us with a glimmer of his old self. My father recovered. It was a slow, arduous process, involving weeks in the hospital and months of rehabilitation, but Revivane, the drug my company developed, the drug whose journey to approval I had personally overseen, had stopped the devastating autoimmune attack in its tracks. He had cheated death, thanks to a convergence of cutting-edge science and a daughter whose career her family had never understood. My new life, or rather, my existing life viewed through a new lens, continued. I was still Celeste Hartwell, Vice President at PharmaLife Innovations. I still went to work, led my teams, tackled complex scientific and business challenges, but something profound had shifted within me and within my family. The quiet vindication I felt was immense, yet tinged with a lingering sadness for all the lost years of genuine understanding. The peace I found was not in their newfound respect, though that was interesting to navigate. The true peace came from the undeniable, tangible proof of my life's worth, demonstrated in the most personal way imaginable. I no longer craved their validation. I had validated myself, and my work had spoken in a way words never could. My success was no longer an abstract concept for them, it had a face, my father's recovering smile. The long-term status of my antagonistic family relationships was complicated. My mother, once she absorbed the shock, was effusive in her apologies, her gratitude, and a newfound, almost overwhelming pride. Celeste, my brilliant daughter, the lifesaver. She'd exclaim to anyone who would listen. It was a bit much, a pendulum swung too far in the opposite direction, but I knew it was her way of processing her guilt and relief. Aunt Carol was more subdued, offering quiet, heartfelt thanks, her previous condescension replaced by a hesitant deference. David was the most difficult, he struggled. The man who had always been the golden child, the one in charge, had been rendered helpless, then saved by the sister he'd consistently, if perhaps unconsciously, dismissed. He offered a stiff, formal apology. "Celeste, I misjudged you, badly. What you did for Dad, thank you." Our relationship remained strained for a long time. There was a new, wary respect from him, but the easy, dismissive superiority was gone, replaced by an awkwardness he didn't quite know how to navigate. He could no longer pigeonhole me, and that unsettled him. I didn't rub it in, there was no need, the facts spoke for themselves. I dictated the terms of our interactions now, not with words, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knew her worth, independently of their opinions. Some days, I saw genuine regret in his eyes. Other days, just the lingering discomfort of a worldview shattered. True reconciliation is a long road, and some chasms, once created, can never be fully bridged, only navigated with care. My final reflection on this journey is multifaceted. There's the incredible, almost unbelievable irony of it all, that the very work they dismissed as drug sales would be the key to my father's survival. It taught me that sometimes the most profound impact comes not from grand pronouncements, but from quiet competence, from the diligent pursuit of knowledge and purpose. I learned that being underestimated, while painful, can also be a strange, quiet fuel. It forced me to rely on my own internal compass, to define my own success. The greatest lesson, perhaps, was about the nature of worth. For so long, a part of me had yearned for their approval, their understanding. But in that hospital, I realized that my value wasn't contingent on their perception. It was inherent in my actions, in my knowledge, in the dedication I brought to my life's work. The ultimate validation wasn't their stunned silence or their belated apologies, it was the quiet hum of the machines monitoring my father's recovery, the slow return of color to his cheeks. That was real. That mattered. So, what about you? Have you ever had an experience where your true skills or passion were completely overlooked, only to become crucially important later? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. We can all learn from each other's journeys of being underestimated and ultimately proving our worth, if only to ourselves. And if this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt that sting of being misjudged or had to fight for recognition, please give this video a like. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about navigating life's challenges and finding your strength. My final thought for you is this: your value isn't diminished by someone else's inability to see it. Trust in your path, cultivate your knowledge, and know that sometimes the most important validation comes not from external applause, but from the quiet, undeniable impact you make on the world, or even just on one precious life that truly matters.